Logan J. Carter wasn't looking for trouble. The former Navy SEAL had only been out of the service for a few weeks, and everything about civilian life still felt unfamiliar. Too quiet, slow, and disjointed. That night, he'd walked into a small bar on the waterfront of Bayfield, a coastal town, where he rented a tiny room above a tackle shop. The place was called the Anchor's End Lowlights, creaky bar stools, the scent of sea salt and old wood in the air. Logan wasn't there to start a conversation or make an impression. He simply wanted a beer and a few minutes of normalcy. No uniform, no medals, just jeans, a plain black t-shirt, and a well-worn ball cap pulled low over tired eyes. He took a quiet seat near the back and kept to himself. He hadn't even touched his drink when the owner approached. Gus Martelli was a thick-set man with a face carved by decades of suspicion. Arms crossed over his chest, he stood in front of Logan's table, like a man who'd made up his mind long before the first word was spoken. "You looking to make trouble?" he asked, his voice louder than it needed to be. "Because I've seen your kind before. All intense and brooding. Military types. Always ends the same way, loud, drunk, and breaking something." Logan looked up, calm but firm. "Just here for a beer," he said. "Well, take your beer somewhere else," Gus snapped, jabbing a thumb toward the door. "I run a clean place. Don't need anyone scaring off my regulars." Logan's jaw tensed, but he didn't rise to the bait. No raised voice, no sudden move. Just silence and that unshakable SEAL discipline. To be judged not for your actions, but for the weight of your presence, was this what civilian life had to offer? If you believe no one should ever be turned away for serving their country, or for simply sitting in quiet dignity, then let this story speak to you. Because what happened next wasn't about revenge. It was about honor, loyalty, and the quiet power of showing up. If you stand with that kind of respect, drop a comment below, honored. And don't forget to hit subscribe for more stories that remind us who we are when the uniform comes off, but the brotherhood remains. 15 years in the Navy SEALs had taught Logan J. Carter how to operate in the world's harshest environments, jungles that steam with danger, deserts that bake the soul-dry cities where every shadow might hide a threat. But nothing had prepared him for this silence. The kind of silence settles in when the mission ends, the uniform is folded and stored away, and your name becomes just another line on a DD-214 form. Logan had been honorably discharged after his last deployment. A fractured ankle that never fully healed and a lingering shoulder injury meant he was done medically, officially, permanently. He wasn't ready. Not even close. He drifted into Bayfield, a sleepy coastal town that smelled of salt, rust, and old stories. It wasn't home, but it had the ocean, and that was enough. Something about the tides gave him space to breathe, something the crowds and chaos of the cities couldn't offer. He rented a small room above a bait and tackle shop near the docks. No TV, no air conditioning. He just had a mattress, a kettle, and a duffel bag full of memories he wasn't sure what to do with. His landlord, an old fisherman named Ray, didn't ask questions. Logan appreciated that. But the truth was, civilian life didn't fit him. He moved through it like a man wearing the wrong size skin. The rules felt different, unwritten, and often illogical. He wasn't angry, just disconnected. Here, no one moved with intention. No one scanned a room instinctively. No one checked exits or read body language. And no one, not a single person, understood what it meant to lose sleep, not because of noise, but because of the absence of it. Sometimes he missed the chaos. But more than that, he missed the clarity, the sense of purpose. On deployment, every moment mattered. Every man beside you was your brother. Every order had weight. Out here, people argued about coffee orders and parking spaces like it was life or death. They looked at Logan like he was too serious, quiet, or intense. So when he walked into the Anchor's End the night before, he wasn't looking for confrontation. He just wanted a place to sit and exist. A beer. A pause. A moment where he could feel human again. Instead, he got told he didn't belong. And that, more than the words themselves, was the bitterest cut. Because after giving your all for your country, a small part of you hopes that when you come home, the country might make room for you again. But sometimes, as Logan was learning, the battlefield doesn't end at the border. It just changes shape. And this time it came in the form of a bar stool, a quiet drink, and a man named Gus Martelli who never saw past the surface. But someone else did, and they were on their way. To understand Logan J. Carter, you had to look past the cliches. He wasn't the towering, muscle-bound action hero Hollywood liked to imagine when discussing Navy SEALs. He wasn't loud. He didn't carry himself like he had something to prove. And he wasn't interested in impressing anyone. If anything, Logan moved like a shadow, purposeful, precise, and almost invisible to those not paying attention. He stood just under 6 feet tall, lean from a lifetime of discipline rather than gym selfies. His eyes steel gray and always scanning held the weight of things unsaid. The kind of gaze made some people uneasy, not because it was threatening, but because it saw too much. It missed nothing. Logan didn't speak unless there was something worth saying. He listened more than he talked, observed more than he acted. In a world addicted to noise, that alone set him apart. He wore the same clothes almost daily, a plain fitted t-shirt jeans that had faded naturally through years of wear boots, that had seen more ground than most people ever would, and a sun-bleached ball cap pulled low to shade his eyes. Nothing branded, nothing flashy, just functional, lived-in simplicity. There were scars on his knuckles and a faint line across his left cheek, gifts from a world far away earned rather than chosen. He never mentioned them. Most didn't ask; those who did rarely got an answer. But perhaps the most defining part of Logan wasn't visible. It was the silence he carried like armor. It wasn't the silence of a man with nothing to say, but the silence of a man who'd already said enough, seen enough, done enough. There was a calmness to him that came not from peace, but from surviving chaos. The kind of calm that came from knowing exactly who you were when everything else was stripped away. And that was the thing. Logan knew who he was. He didn't need validation. He didn't need thanks. He didn't even need understanding. What he wanted, what he was still learning how to find, was a place where he could simply exist without being treated like a threat. But the world often mistakes stillness for danger. People like Gus Martelli didn't see a tired man or a man trying to rebuild. They saw posture as defiance, silence as arrogance, a calm gaze as a confrontation. And in their insecurity, they struck first, believing that pushing someone like Logan away would keep the peace. They failed to realize this: Logan Carter wasn't looking for a fight. But if one came to him, he wouldn't need to raise his voice or even his fists. Because people like Logan didn't fight with anger. They fought with presence, with restraint, with the quiet, immovable strength of someone who had nothing to prove but everything left to protect. And no matter how alone he looked that night at the anchor's end, Logan was never truly alone. Because men like him are rarely just one man. Behind every quiet warrior there are brothers, and sometimes those brothers show up when the world forgets who they're dealing with. Gus Martelli didn't hate veterans. At least that's what he would have told you if asked. He had a flag out front, a few military challenge coins in a dusty display case near the register, and a "Support Our Troops" sticker half faded on the back door. But none of those things were rooted in respect. They were just decorations. Symbols used to appease, not to honor. The truth was, Gus had carried a quiet grudge for years. It dated back to a single night long ago when a group of young sailors got into a brawl at the anchor's end, shouting glass, breaking fists flying. One broken window and a handful of unpaid tabs later, Gus decided no more military types. They were all the same in his mind: loud, confrontational, unpredictable. It didn't matter that the vast majority weren't like that. It didn't matter that the ones who served had given more than he could understand. Gus held on to that one incident like it was gospel. It gave him a reason to judge without guilt. So the moment Logan Carter walked into his bar, something in Gus stiffened. Logan never said a word out of place, never looked at anyone too long. But to Gus, that quiet focus, the way Logan scanned the room, the posture, the stillness, it all felt threatening. Not because Logan was doing anything wrong, but because Gus couldn't handle a man he couldn't read. The moment Logan sat down, Gus had already made up his mind. He waited 20 minutes, watching from the corner of his eye. Logan just sat there calmly nursing a beer, occasionally glancing at the nautical maps pinned to the wall. But Gus had seen enough. He lumbered over with a scowl and folded arms looming beside the table like a storm cloud ready to burst. "You casing the place?" Gus asked, loud enough for the few patrons to hear. Logan looked up confused. "No," he replied evenly. "Just drinking a beer." "Don't like your kind of thinking," Gus muttered. "Makes people nervous." "My kind?" Logan asked, his voice still calm, though a flicker of tension passed through his eyes. Gus leaned in, his breath a mix of beer and bitterness. "Yeah, the silent, squared-away, dangerous-looking kind. Always ends badly with you guys. I've had enough of it. Logan raised an eyebrow. I haven't said a word to anyone but the bartender. Don't care, Gus snapped. I run a clean place. I don't like your vibe. Finish up and get out. Logan could have said more. Could have stood up, raised his voice, called out the absurdity of being judged for doing absolutely nothing. But he didn't, because that wasn't who he was. Instead, he slowly set his half-full beer down on the table, pushed his chair in, and stood. There was no anger in his movement, just quiet disappointment. Keep the change, he said softly, even though he hadn't been handed a bill. As he walked toward the exit, Gus called after him, voice dripping with false bravado, and don't come back, you hear? We don't need your kind of trouble. Logan didn't respond, didn't look back, didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. But the weight of that moment stayed with him, because for all he'd endured in silence, nothing cut deeper than being turned away. Not for something he did, but simply for who he was. And though Logan had walked out alone, the silence he carried was about to echo far louder than Gus Martelli could ever imagine. There were 100 things Logan Carter could have done that night. He could have turned around and let Gus Martelli know firmly physically just how wrong he was. He could have made a scene, demanded an apology, challenged the injustice head on. He could have called the police or filed a formal complaint, and no one would have blamed him. But Logan didn't do any of that, because Logan wasn't wired to seek revenge. He wasn't there to make a point. He'd spent too many years making real decisions under real fire to waste energy on petty conflict. And after everything he'd been through, he knew that walking away with your dignity intact took far more strength than throwing a punch. So he did what he always did when the world made too much noise. He found somewhere quiet. A few blocks down from the anchor's end, he leaned against a seawall, the ocean breeze brushing against his face. He watched the lights flicker across the water, listened to the distant clatter of fishing boats coming in for the night. The bitterness of the moment still churned in his chest, not because of the insult, but because of how familiar it felt. After all these years, still being misunderstood, still being feared for something he never said, still being judged for the discipline in his posture and the silence in his soul, Logan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Not to scroll, not to distract, just one action. He opened a secure messaging app, one that hadn't been used in months, but remained installed on his phone like a quiet lifeline. It was a direct line to his old SEAL team. The channel wasn't meant for everyday chatter. It existed for check-ins, quiet reunions, or moments like this when one of them needed to be heard without saying much. His fingers moved with steady purpose. He typed a short clinical message. No emotion, no drama. FYI, Anchor's End Bar, Bayfield, Gus Martelli, disrespected veteran, ejected. No cause. Logan. He stared at it for a moment, then hit send. That was it. No rant, no expectation, just information. A data point passed quietly between brothers. Logan didn't need anyone to storm in and fix things. He didn't expect anything at all. But he knew one truth that never failed him. You never really walk alone. Even when the world turns its back, even when strangers see you as a threat, there are people out there who remember who you are and they stand ready. Because when one of their own sends up a flare, SEALs don't ask questions. They respond. The next day at exactly 3:00 p.m., Gus Martelli unlocked the door to the Anchor's End like it was any other shift. The same rusty key, the same sticky handle, the same faint smell of beer and salt in the air. He whistled to himself as he propped the door open, convinced he'd done the right thing the night before. Kept the place clean, he muttered. Can't have just anybody walking in like they own it. But across the street, 3 unmarked black vans pulled up one after the other, smooth and silent. They didn't rumble in or swerve dramatically. They arrived precisely deliberately, like they had planned the route down to the inch. Gus paused mid-step. These weren't delivery trucks. The doors slid open. One by one, 12 men stepped out, all dressed in plain jeans, t-shirts, worn boots. Some wore hats, others sunglasses. They looked like regular guys until you actually looked. There was something in the way they moved, something unspoken, controlled, calculated. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them smiled. But every head turned. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. At the front was Reese Blaze Maddox, a man whose calm presence was louder than most men shouting. Former SEAL team leader. Logan's commanding officer. A man who had led operations in war zones most people couldn't find on a map and made it back with every man he took in. Blaze stepped forward, eyes locked on Gus. Behind him, the others followed, not in rigid formation, but with a kind of quiet symmetry. Years of working as a unit didn't disappear just because the uniforms were gone. They didn't need to announce who they were. Their posture, their eyes, their presence, it said everything. Gus took a step back instinctively. These weren't tourists. These weren't customers. These were men who had fought, bled, and survived together, and they were standing on his doorstep. Gus's smirk from the night before faded. The air shifted. Bartenders paused. A couple of regulars at the far end of the bar stood up, grabbed their jackets, and walked out without a word. The weight of the room had changed. The bouncer who'd once loomed so confidently behind the counter now shrank into the background, suddenly interested in rearranging bottles. Blaze stopped just short of the door, hands relaxed at his sides, expression unreadable. He wasn't angry, he wasn't aggressive, he didn't have to be. He just stood there like a verdict that had already been written. And in that stillness, Gus Martelli finally understood. He hadn't just insulted a man the night before. He had misjudged a brotherhood. And the brotherhood had come to remind him what respect really looked like. Gus Martelli stood frozen in the doorway of the Anchor's End, eyes darting between the 12 men who now formed an immovable wall of quiet strength in front of his bar. At the center stood Reese Blaze Maddox, calm and centered with the posture of a man who had faced down far greater threats in far darker corners of the world. But there was something about this moment, this stillness, that radiated far more weight than any shouted threat ever could. Blaze finally spoke, his voice low, even, but carved from steel. Gus Martelli. Gus cleared his throat. Yeah, that's me. Blaze took a small step forward, just enough to make the distance between them feel uncomfortably intimate. We understand you had an incident here last night, he said, with a man named Logan Carter. Gus laughed nervously. It wasn't an incident, just a misunderstanding. He was acting strange, made people nervous. Blaze tilted his head slightly. Strange, you mean quiet, reserved, respectful. Gus faltered. I didn't mean, look, I've had issues before. Military types. Caused trouble, I was just protecting the bar. You weren't protecting anything, Blaze said, his voice flattening. You profiled a man based on his bearing, his silence, his service. You disrespected someone who has given more to this country than most people ever will. Behind Blaze, one of the SEALs let out a low sound, not quite a laugh, more like the low rumble of thunder. Gus flinched. Blaze didn't blink. You judged him, threw him out, humiliated him. Not because of anything he did, but because of your own fear and your own ignorance. I didn't mean anything by it, Gus began. You did enough, Blaze cut in. Now here's what's going to happen. The pause was razor sharp. You're going to call Logan Carter. You're going to apologize publicly and sincerely, not because we ask, but because it's the right thing to do. Gus opened his mouth but thought better of it. Blaze continued, and after that, you're going to make a substantial donation to the Navy SEAL Foundation. Under Logan's name. A donation. Gus blinked. How much are we talking? Blaze turned slightly and gestured to one of the men behind him. You'll discuss the numbers with Doc. He's our team medic. Also happens to be extremely good with figures. Consider it an investment in character and in repairing a very public mistake. Gus looked like he'd swallowed a rock. And from now on, Blaze said, stepping even closer, this bar will either be known as a place that honors veterans with dignity, or it will be remembered as the bar that turned its back on one of them. That's your choice. There was no threat in his voice, just truth. And Gus Martelli knew in that moment there was no room left for excuses, only action. For the next hour, the Anchor's End didn't feel like a bar anymore. It felt like a courtroom one where no one needed a gavel, and the silence spoke louder than any sentence ever could. After Blaze delivered the ultimatum, he and the rest of the team stepped inside. They didn't crowd around the bar. They didn't speak. They didn't even sit together. Instead, the 12 SEALs spread out quietly, occupying separate tables, each one facing a different corner of the room, an instinctual formation that came from years of covering each other's backs. No one said a word. They didn't order drinks, didn't tap fingers on tables, didn't check their phones. They just sat, each man radiating a calm, coiled energy that seemed to settle into the very walls of the bar. And it was suffocating. Customers who had wandered in expecting a casual afternoon beer took one look at the atmosphere and turned around. A couple tried to stay, made it 5 minutes pretending to sip their drinks, then quietly slipped out the door. The bartender, usually chatty and loud, now moved in near silence, polishing the same glass over and over, eyes darting nervously from table to table. The bouncer, who had stood so tall the night before, now leaned against the back wall, arms folded tightly, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The only sound was the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional creak of an old bar stool shifting under a seal's weight. And Gus Martelli, he wasn't on the floor. He was in his cramped office in the back, behind a half-shut door with Doc. Unlike the others, Doc had a certain disarming quality. His voice was calm, even warm. But his words, they carried weight. Years of handling both wounded bodies and tight logistics had made him an expert at two things: patching things up and naming a fair price. The conversation behind the door was quiet but firm. Gus tried to bargain, tried to justify, tried to spin the narrative in his favor. Doc didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice. He simply outlined what substantial meant, what sincerity looked like in dollars, what public accountability required, not just in action, but in gesture. Back in the bar, the team waited, patiently, without drama. Their presence alone made the message clear. This wasn't vengeance. This was restoration. You don't humiliate one of ours and carry on like nothing happened. You acknowledge it, you fix it, you change. By the time Gus emerged from the office, pale, sweating, and visibly humbled, the tone of the room had shifted entirely. He didn't speak to the team. Not yet. He had one more call to make, and 12 silent men sat in quiet expectation, waiting for that final step. Because sometimes respect doesn't walk through the door with noise. Sometimes it sits in stillness and won't leave until the damage is undone. Gus Martelli stood behind the bar, phone in hand, his fingers trembling just enough to betray the weight of what he was about to do. The dozen silent men still sat scattered around the room, watching without watching. No pressure, no threats, just presence. But that was all it took. Gus tapped Logan's number, the one Doc had typed in for him, and brought the phone to his ear. The line rang once, twice, then Logan Carter. The voice on the other end was calm, unreadable, exactly as Gus remembered it. Logan, it's Gus Martelli from the Anchor's End. A pause. Logan didn't hang up, but he didn't rush to fill the silence either. Gus swallowed. I wanted to say I was wrong about everything. You didn't do anything to deserve the way I treated you. And I can't take it back, but I can say this: I'm sorry. Still silence. Gus pushed through. I didn't see you for who you were. I saw something I made up in my head. Fear, prejudice, whatever it wasn't right. And it sure as hell wasn't respectful. Another beat passed. Then Logan spoke quietly. What changed? Gus looked around the room at the team that had said nothing yet, somehow said everything. Let's just say, wow, your friends reminded me what respect really looks like. Gus cleared his throat. If you ever feel like stopping by again, first drinks on the house. For as long as I'm behind this bar. There was a soft chuckle on the line. Not bitter, not mocking, just measured. We'll see, Logan replied, and he hung up. A week later, on a quiet Tuesday evening, the door to the Anchor's End opened again. Logan Carter walked in. No fanfare, no backup, just him. He wore the same ball cap, the same jeans, the same quiet energy, but something was different. The room didn't tense this time. The air didn't shift in suspicion. Gus was already behind the bar. The moment he saw Logan, he stepped forward without hesitation. Logan, he said simply, welcome back, no performance, no overcompensating. He reached for a clean glass, poured the beer himself, and set it on the bar with both hands. On the house. No expiration date. The bouncer who once loomed behind Logan with folded arms gave him a nod. Not forced, not fearful, just respectful. Logan didn't smile, he didn't gloat, he didn't need to. He just took the beer, gave a small nod in return, and walked to a table near the window. He sipped in silence the way he always had, not to prove a point, but because finally he didn't have to. After that day, the Anchor's End wasn't quite the same. The bar didn't change its decor. The beer didn't get better. The lights still flickered slightly over the pool table near the back. But the energy that changed, word spread quietly through Bayfield's veteran community. There wasn't a big announcement, no social media campaign, just quiet conversations in barbershops, VA halls, and around campfires. Logan Carter walked back in. And they welcomed him this time. Whole damn SEAL team made it happen. Soon other veterans started showing up, some in faded ball caps like Logan's, some in pressed polos with service pins no one noticed before. They weren't loud. They didn't demand attention. They just came, sat, and were treated like everyone else. Respect wasn't written on a sign, it was in the atmosphere. And the donation, it landed exactly where it should have, under Logan's name at the Navy SEAL Foundation. Enough to fund therapy sessions, transition support, and scholarships for the children of fallen operators. The bar didn't ask for recognition, neither did Logan. But the people who needed to know, they knew. Among SEALs, the story became something of a quiet legend, not because of confrontation, but because of restraint. Because 12 men showed up not to fight, but to stand, to witness, to remind the world in the most disciplined way possible that brotherhood doesn't vanish when the uniform comes off. You don't need rank to lead. You don't need weapons to win. Sometimes all it takes is presence. Logan Carter never asked for a rescue, but he got one anyway. Because true brotherhood isn't built in barracks or battlefields. It's built in the moments after, when no one's watching, when there's no glory, and when a quiet man is quietly wronged. And for those who've worn the uniform, there's a simple truth: brotherhood doesn't end at discharge. And sometimes you don't need to raise a fist to teach someone what respect really means. You just need to show up 12 strong and sit down and wait. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that respect should never depend on appearance, silence, or status, then don't let it end here. Share it, not for views, not for likes, but because somewhere there's another Logan Carter, sitting quietly, bearing the weight of service, hoping the world still has room for people like him. And if you're someone who's worn the uniform, or loved someone who has, then you already understand what this was really about. It's not about bars or beer or bad decisions. It's about the invisible bonds that outlast the battlefield. It's about the men who never stop standing watch no matter how far from war they've come. It's about loyalty earned in silence and repaid in presence. So if you believe in that kind of brotherhood, the kind that shows up, the kind that waits, the kind that never forgets, leave a comment below. I stand with Logan, and don't forget to subscribe, because there are more stories that deserve to be told. Stories that remind us that some heroes never stop protecting, even when the fight is over.